Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who, as you well know, has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Let us talk about nuclear energy, and in particular, like nuclear power in this sense, right? And perhaps no talk about nuclear energy can be made without mentioning of Chernobyl disaster, of course. So let us talk about this first. The best estimate that I've seen by WHO, World Health Organization, is that a Chernobyl disaster has led in total to about 4,000 deaths, like for all the period of time, so to speak, after and during the disaster, right? So approximately like a couple of hundred people died from acute radiation syndrome, like those were the people who were trying to, let's say, get rid of any immediate consequences. I mean, they've tried to clean the place up and build this dome around it, etc., right? And the other ones, like the majority of victims, so to speak, of the disaster comes from cancer, basically, due to this extra pollution by radioactive material, right? The nuclear fallout, etc. But at the same time, it is a consensus among people who study this subject that no detectable like abnormalities or mutations have been found in children, like in, let's say, post-Chernobyl births. Like, well, there were of course abnormalities found, but they weren't larger than previously, statistically speaking, right? So it doesn't seem like there was any impact of that sort, like any sort of mutations, etc. And neither in Chernobyl nor, I mean, in this general area, nor in, let's say, Hiroshima or Nagasaki in Japan, which were bombed by the US in World War II, no congenital or congenital anomalies were found, right? The only thing they found in Japan was that among survivors, I repeat, of the bombings, well, I didn't repeat, so among survivors, now I did, there was a 42% increase in cancer rates again. So, like, again, statistically speaking, it translates into diminishing of the longevity by 1 year on average, again. So the survivors of bombings lived on average 1 year shorter than any average Japanese person in some other place, which doesn't sound like a lot, right? But in Chernobyl's case, like if you look at data from 1986, which is the year of the disaster, until 1994, the longevity became smaller at 6 years. So it was like 70 years in 1986, and it became 64 in 1994. And you might say, well, what a horror. I mean, it was like worse than those bombings, right? And there was like a book printed in 2007, I think, somewhere in New York, by some scientists who claimed that, well, yeah, it means that Chernobyl has led to like 1 million deaths, actually. But that's the thing you do see. What you don't see, or rather what they don't tell you, is that this decline in longevity was the same in let's say, Chernobyl area and everywhere else in post-Soviet Union. Well, because it was caused by the collapse of the Soviet Union and not the Chernobyl disaster itself. So it just goes to show that, well, basically socialism is like 6 times worse for your health and well-being than a nuclear bombing. And I think it's a good thing to remember. And yeah, you might say, well, collapse of the Soviet Union is kind of like the end of socialism, right? Isn't it? But So socialism was actually good because it was the longevity was higher, etc., etc. But again, see my comment about it in the video. I think it was in Capitalism and Social Darwinism, or maybe it was in the video about Archimedes' lever of speculation. I cannot really tell, but the argument was that blaming end of socialism for these deaths is like blaming end of let's say heroin addiction for all the bad things it does to you, right? So it's like it's a really good analogy, like to say that socialism was good because when it ended it caused all those bad things is like telling you that, well, heroin addiction is good because when it ends, like when you're trying to go to rehab, etc., you get all those detrimental effects. It's pretty much the same thing. But okay, so in general, like radiation doesn't seem to be that dangerous to people. So again, as I've said, there were no detectable differences in the next generation. Only the people who were directly affected by this fallout, let's say, they've had problems. Or especially at the site itself, people got like literally this acute radiation syndrome, etc. But studies have been made in some places on Earth where there's a natural higher radiation dose just due to natural causes. Like one of such places is called Ramsar in Iran. So there the average dose is about 260 millisieverts per year, whereas the norm around the globe is around 3 millisieverts per year. So it's like 80 times, more than 80 times larger in this place. And studies have been made, like, do these people have more mutations, more anomalies, etc.? And no, it was concluded that there isn't any difference. In fact, I think actually that the longevity of people who live there is actually higher than in other places, at least in Iran. Okay, so yeah, and 500 millisieverts per year is considered to be like the safety limit. So Ramsar with its 260 is well below this limit. Which is used at least by NASA to estimate the radiation risks for astronauts, right? Because above 500 per year, you get all the risk of getting cancer, let's say, increases. That's basically all that it is. And if you get 5 sieverts in an hour, that's more or less a lethal dose. So the limit of safety, so to speak, is like 1/10 of a lethal dose, like prolonged for a whole year. So it's a really small amount of radiation, right? And other thing that was found in all these studies is that there is no harm to pregnancy, to pregnant women and their children, if they got some radiation dose, let's say. Like to really harm the baby, you need to give woman a dose, or a baby also, a dose of about 4 sieverts, which is, again, it's pretty close to the lethal limit in the first place, right? So, yeah, well, there you go. So, roughly speaking, if a woman survives, the baby would be okay. That's the point, basically. And it's well shown, I mean, all those fears about fertility of people who got some radiation doses, it's really clearly demonstrated, I mean, the rubbishness of these arguments in like the first half of the 20th century US, where people tried to force all those eugenic programs, etc. So people imposed on certain women, at least, forced sterilization. So the land of the free, yeah, that's what you get there. So people tried to sterilize women with radiation, I mean forcibly sterilize. And the funny thing is, even though the subject isn't funny at all, that 40% of women who undergone this treatment, so to speak, gave birth. So it wasn't really successful, you know. Anyway, and well, you might ask, well, why only 40%? Well, those were the women who weren't very likely to give birth in the first place, like patients of like mental asylums or something like that. So yeah. All right, and another thing which really made a difference after Chernobyl, definitely, was purely psychological. In particular, again, by some estimates from IAEA, this International Agency for Energy of Atom or something, atomic energy. So they estimate that something around 100 to maybe 200,000 abortions were made after Chernobyl disaster because, well, the mothers feared that their babies would be hurt by it, so they would be mutants, roughly speaking, which again isn't the case at all, but people feared that, etc. So again, IAEA estimates are about 100 to 200,000 abortions, which in perspective isn't that much, actually. Like in the US, after Roe v. Wade, 1974, I think, in total there was like 60 million abortions. So yeah, so oh, by the way, that estimate was about Western Europe. It wasn't about the world. Maybe in the world it will be bigger, actually, but who knows. Anyway, so yeah, and another thing I wanted to point out is that life actually thrives in Chernobyl area. Like it's like a super lush area right now. Well, firstly because, well, the area itself is lush in the first place. I mean, it's northern Ukraine. It's like fields of grass and forests and things like that. And now you have all kinds of wild animals there and fish. It's like super big, not because it's a mutant fish, it's just because it's not, there's no fishing going on, right? So people kind of moved away from there, and nature prospers because of that, right? So that's another thing to remember. And so, well, my point is that nature isn't really affected by any of it. That's what I'm saying. And okay, let's shift the topic a little bit and talk about the other ways, the other ways of electricity generation, for example. And maybe you don't know this, but, well, in this case, you would know now that thermal power stations are actually even more radioactive than nuclear power stations, nuclear power plants, because they throw into the atmosphere all kinds of stuff, and I mean, including radioactive stuff that is contained in those fuels that they're burning. And plus, a huge problem from thermal power plants is the pollution, of course. So they throw all this soot and like all these microparticles in the atmosphere, and it causes much more deaths than, again, Chernobyl did. And Chernobyl, like, you should have to keep in mind that it's responsible for like 99.9% of all the deaths due to nuclear power. So these really 4,000, it's basically all the victims of nuclear energy generation. Whereas in the US alone, it is estimated that about 52,000 people die per year due to thermal power plants, especially due to those microparticles that they release. But perhaps radiation also plays some role. I mean, radiation produced by emissions of thermal power stations. Okay, so in terms of statistics, again, nuclear power causes about 90 deaths per trillion of kilowatt hours, right? And it's actually tens to hundreds of times lower than almost any other type of energy production. Like if we're talking about well, again, thermal power plants, I've already told you how much more dangerous they are, like hundreds of times more dangerous than nuclear power plants. And by dangerous, I don't mean accidents or whatever, just their operation causes much more deaths than nuclear energy would ever hope to, let's say, if it was its purpose. Okay, and all the others also cause all kinds of problems. If you think about wind energy, well, people regularly die because, well, the people who build those things and like do some maintenance, whatever, they just fall and die. If you think about solar power on the roofs, there's the same problem. Or solar power, like these giant power plants, which like boil some water, like those mirrors or whatever they use. Well, it regularly kills birds, for example, so it's also not very cool, etc., etc. So in this sense, nuclear is really one of the safest, if not the safest, and by far, like again, by orders of magnitude, a couple of orders of magnitude, than any other way of energy generation, right? And actually, there's another way of looking at it, and there was a study done by NASA, and if I wouldn't screw up, I'll show you the picture right now on the screen. So what the picture shows is, well, this description is there in the first place, but it shows that how many deaths per year were prevented due to the usage of nuclear energy. So let's say we've had a lot of thermal power stations and now we have nuclear power plants instead. So how much safer the world became, so to speak, how much people remained alive thanks to this transition to nuclear energy, at least like partial transition that we have. And as you can see, it's pretty substantial. I mean, nuclear energy killed much less people than it saves per year. I repeat, it's like 80,000 or something per year around the world, whereas it killed only 4,000. So it's pretty significant, I think. All right, so other thing that is clear and obvious is that, again, nuclear power reduces pollution. Like, it doesn't throw anything out, you know, as thermal power plants do, for example. And also it reduces CO2 emissions. Like, if you care about that sort of thing, I mean, if you're in this camp of these moronic advocates of anthropogenic global warming, then you should care about it too, that nuclear power plants are zero in terms of carbon emissions, right? Well, you might say, well, wait a minute, how can you say that it's zero pollution if we have nuclear waste, which is super dangerous? And it is super dangerous, but it's exactly the thing that the waste of a thermal power plant is thrown into the atmosphere and nobody cares about it. Whereas the nuclear waste is treated very carefully and it is stored deliberately so that it wouldn't harm anyone, right? And again, the waste that is produced when people make the solar panels or wind generators or whatever, it's also just thrown away into your rivers and oceans and soil and whatnot, and the atmosphere, obviously. And it's not a very cool thing, you know. So the green energy isn't really as green as you might think. Like it's perhaps sort of like this acidic, toxic type of green. Then yeah, I would agree that it is indeed green. Okay, but yeah, nuclear in this sense is much more controlled, conscious, and like cool in general. And I should say that some of these points I took from Michael Schellenberger. You might find his talks on YouTube, for example, his TED Talks about nuclear energy. But okay, but another thing I wanted to mention here with regards to nuclear waste is that there's a certain complexes, like certain sites around the world where they store wastes, and these aren't, for some reason, I don't know why, but these are always sort of under maintenance. if that's even a word. Like there's a place called Mayak, which is literally means lighthouse in Russian, in Russia, where they store some of the nuclear waste, and it's like horrible in the sense that it's under maintenance, like it's every now and then, like every few years, or maybe at least a couple of decades, there's like some, I wouldn't say explosion, but some emission of radioactive material from there. Like I think one actually happened like a couple of years ago, or maybe in 2018. But you probably remember there was also these tests of nuclear rockets in Russia or something. So maybe it was that thing, and I'm kind of confusing those. But anyway, another place like that is in U.S. Again, the so-called Hanford site in Washington. The same Hanford, by the way, where LIGO detector is placed, one of the two LIGO detectors. One is in Louisiana, in Livingston, and another one is in Hanford, Washington. So in Hanford, Washington, they also have this huge storage of nuclear waste, and it's so poorly maintained that like these tanks are like already leaking, and people already say that we should do something about it, but somehow the government doesn't really care. Like it's almost like they deliberately don't care to produce a catastrophe, you know, to produce sort of like a second Chernobyl or a second Fukushima, if you like, something like that. So like it's definitely a thing in this sense, in the sense of sort of conspiracy theories or something like that. But okay, in general, I think it follows from what I said that nuclear power is by far the safest and cleanest of all the ways of generating power. But you might say, well, again, like what the hell? How can you say it's the safest if it can produce things like Chernobyl or Fukushima again? Well, one thing you should know, and hopefully you know already, but maybe you don't, so I'll tell you that Chernobyl disaster wasn't produced in a normal kind of way. It's not like reactor just decided to explode, you know. What happened there was that people deliberately, manually switched off all the safety mechanisms so that they could perform some sort of experiments with the reactor. So that's what was done. So it wasn't a reactor malfunction in the first place. It was a deliberate, how would you say it, mistreatment, so to speak, of reactor from the people who were responsible for it. So it wouldn't have happened without this intervention, let's say. All right. And in general, those same types of reactors, RBMK 1000, I think, they keep working in a lot of other power plants, and they feel okay. Like it's a pretty shitty design, to be honest, but it's still decent. It works reliably. And well, like in Kursk, in St. Petersburg, and well, not in St. Petersburg itself, but some tens of kilometers from it, and in Smolensk in Russia, those are 3 power plants that still operate these reactors. And even in Chernobyl itself, the other, well, at least 2 or perhaps 3, I think there were 3 other reactors. So reactor 4 got this explosion due to funny experiments they were making there, but the other 3 reactors felt fine, and then they continued to work. I think the first one was closed in 1996, so that's like 10 years after the disaster, and the last one was closed in 2000, so that's 14 years, yeah, right? And nothing bad happened there at all. Okay. And with Fukushima, it's a different story, but long story short, it actually would be able to survive this tsunami or whatever. Reactor would be fine. It's just that it was shut down, again, deliberately, to prevent whatever bad stuff happening. But unfortunately, they needed electrical power to basically remove all the material from there, and they couldn't have it. Well, firstly, because they've shut their reactor down, but secondly, because they couldn't like launch their additional generators for some, like there are some anecdotes about this situation, like they literally had like different plugs, like different outlets or something, so they couldn't launch them, they couldn't switch them on, I mean, so whatever. So reactor was actually doing fine. It was that the, let's say, disorganized way they've shut it off, that's what was the problem. If they kept it working, they could have shut it down more properly and in much better situation, and no release of radioactive material would happen. Okay, right. So yeah, well, this is more or less what I wanted to say with regards to safety. So you might ask, well, what does that mean? So why do we have such a negative view on nuclear energy? And I would say that to a large degree, it's because of anti-nuclear propaganda, and certainly mass culture, like that paints this horrible picture of zombies and monsters produced by nuclear radiation or something like that. And in terms of propaganda, there were 8 referendums, at least I've been able to find at least 8 referendums, which, I mean, on nuclear energy, popular voting. So, roughly speaking, 5 of them, and it's a very rough interpretation because, well, they weren't just like, are you for or against nuclear energy? But roughly speaking, 5 of them showed negative results, so people weren't happy with nuclear energy, and 3 showed a positive result. In particular, like there were 2 recent ones, one in Bulgaria in 2013, I think, and one in Taiwan in 2018. So it's like the most recent one, which is actually a good thing. I mean, it gives some hope that it will be okay. But the most terrible one that I know about is the one in Sweden in 1980. Because it didn't even have another option. So basically what they've proposed people are 3 options of how are we going to get rid of nuclear energy. There weren't even an option like maybe we should keep it, maybe we should build more reactors, etc. So it's like really horrible. Like it's just a parody on a referendum. Well, that's Sweden for you, right? Sweden in the 80s especially is like the world's capital of cuckoldry, you know, and various moronic initiatives. But okay, so my country is currently building a nuclear power plant which is supposed to be operating in the next year, and well, it's not like my country is building, it's Russia really that does it, and it's like it causes a lot of concerns because, well, modern Russia isn't really a reliable actor, let's say, so people are really concerned, and I am a little bit concerned, but well, in the sense of not in the sense of safety, but in the sense of that it's just a waste of money, and it probably would it may happen that it wouldn't work or something like that. And Lithuania, who has a border with us, and actually the plant is built near the border with Lithuania, so they're kind of jealous about it because, well, the European Union forced them to close their power plant. And again, 2 referendums that I've mentioned happened in Lithuania. The one in 2008 actually showed a positive result. People said we should keep our nuclear power, which gave them like 70% of their electricity. But it was a low turnout, so less than 50%. So it was considered not, how do you say it? Not too impactful. But in 2012, they've had another referendum, and it showed a negative result. So people said, no, we don't need a new power plant. I mean, already after they've closed the previous one. again, being forced by EU, because, well, apparently the European Union isn't happy that Lithuania is independent in its, at least in energy sense, right? So they don't like that. They want to have more strings to control Lithuanians. So yeah, a lot of those things boils down to politics, unfortunately. But in general, in the world, we have like 450 reactors, about so, operating now, and they give something like 10% of world's electricity production. And the top 3 countries are US, France, and China in terms of the amount of electricity produced by nuclear power plants. Well, of course, in terms of share in countries' energy production, France is the first in the world, but I mean, in terms of just the volume of energy production, the US is first. Okay, but the question is, like, why not have, let's say, 1,000 reactors and have like 20% of world's electricity produced by nuclear energy? It's possible. There's no problem in that. You can build any amount of reactors you want. There is enough uranium. There is like other types of reactors you might build. Or why not have 5,000 reactors and have 100% of electricity produced by nuclear power plants? It's not a problem again. The only problem is political, because people somehow don't like this idea again. And it's completely stupid, I believe. And again, well, you might have alternative setups. It's not necessary that you need to build the current type of, the most frequent type of reactors, which is pressurized water reactor, right? Because, well, it's somewhat unsafe. I mean, you have all this huge pressure, etc., and something might explode, etc., so it's not very cool. But you might have alternative types of nuclear reactors which are developed and were developed long ago, things like fast neutron reactors, things like thorium reactors, like this thorium on molten salt, because it's super safe. Like literally nothing can happen to it, because, well, it's just a molten salt. It's a liquid. It doesn't go anywhere. It's not going to fly anywhere, you know. And if in case of a disaster, like you might make such a setup that, let's say, there would be like a valve, or how would you say it, like a trap door that would be cooled, I mean, under this liquid, that would be cooled by electricity. And if something goes wrong, this cooling stops and it melts under the temperature of this molten salt. And it just flows into some more secure reservoir, some containment vessel. So it would be inherently safe. Like there's nothing bad that can, but okay. So, and one other interesting thing about those thorium reactors, molten salt reactors, is that they are throttleable. Like you can easily change the amount of energy that you get from them, which is super cool for, you know, well, just the grid itself, because you don't need any sort of accumulators or whatever that would damp the imbalances in demand of energy, etc. So it's very convenient. And why they made it throttleable is because, as insane as it may sound, but some people wanted to have a nuclear-powered airplane. So they were developing it specifically to be used on airplanes. And they've succeeded. And I mean, in the 60s and 70s, those kinds of reactors were working in the US, but then for some reason it stopped. So if you're interested in thorium reactors, I recommend you to look on YouTube, for example, for talks by Kirk Sorensen. He's one of the modern proponents of thorium reactors. Okay. Now, one thing you might say, well, wait a minute, Eugene, you work in an institute that deals with nuclear energy. Doesn't that represent a conflict of interests? I mean, you're basically I'm basically making a propaganda for nuclear energy, and well, because I'm an interested party here. And I would say that you probably are correct, or I'm a theoretical physicist. I don't really deal with engineering and reactors, etc. So in this sense, I don't really care. What I do care about is the well-being of people, like wealth of people, and we need nuclear energy to do that. Because, well, again, there's no limit to nuclear energy production. You can get uranium from like literally oceans, from salt water. Well, uranium is everywhere basically. So there is no limit in terms of fuel, and there is no limit in terms of amount of generation, right? It's only the political problems that cause issues with, let's say, increase in nuclear power generation. And it's really sad. Another thing I wanted to mention is that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that I've mentioned, like you are usually shown this picture with from Hiroshima, but Hiroshima, like where's the, like it's literally flat. There's no buildings remaining. But the thing is that Hiroshima was like almost exclusively wooden, or like, you know, these Japanese paper homes basically, right? So it's not a big wonder that it was completely wiped out. But if you look at pictures from Nagasaki, from photos from Nagasaki, there's like at least like 12%, if I'm not mistaken, of homes completely undamaged. So, because, well, there were some stone buildings or like brick buildings or whatever, and you can see on these photos that they just stand there, like nothing happened. I mean, some people were telling me that, you know, when they were at school, there were this sort of, like, I wouldn't call it propaganda, but this idea that, oh, if you see in school, I mean, if you see some nuclear, this mushroom on the horizon, you should like jump under your table or something. And like their point was like, how it's gonna save you? I mean, you're gonna die anyway. Well, no, you wouldn't. I mean, a lot of buildings survive. And it all, of course, depends on how far away were you from the explosion and how strong the explosion was in the first place. But one of the most damaging things in urban areas from nuclear explosion is actually broken glass. Yeah, like it really kills a lot of people. But well, okay, that's a whole separate issue. My point was that the effectiveness of nuclear weapons is seriously overestimated in the general public. I mean, it's not as deadly as you might think it is. Another connected point I wish to make is that we cannot really destroy the planet with our nuclear weapons. It's another sort of myth. Because, and I've made this calculation just out of curiosity recently, we have roughly 14,000 nuclear armaments, like warheads and bombs and things like that. So I just estimated what would happen if all of those were as strong as Tsar bomb, or whatever, how you call it, like the strongest nuclear device that was ever detonated, which was 58 megatons. And that's a lot, believe me. But if we assume that every one of those warheads that we currently have on the globe would be this sort of monster, with like 100-kilometer total destruction radius, which is also overestimated. It's actually lower, but let's give it a benefit of the doubt and say it's 100 kilometers. Then you would still not have enough firepower, so to speak, to cover all the planet. It wouldn't be enough. Like you need more than that. So yeah, it's a myth that we can destroy all the planet, like everything on the surface. I'm not even talking about the subsurface microorganisms, like maybe you're aware of my paper, possible tectonic impact of biosphere, it's called. You might Google that. Or you might see the pattern channel with videos about my hypothesis. But anyway, Yeah, so we cannot really destroy the planet nor the life on it. We can probably destroy our civilization with nuclear weapons, but that's about it. Nothing more than that. And another concept that is sort of overestimated is nuclear winter. Because, well, as the legend says, when they initially came up with this concept, it was simply because people assumed that the soot, or how you call it, like whatever, the dust doesn't settle. So they didn't know how far the dust settles, so they put this coefficient equals to 0, so it would just hang there, right? So that's how the concept of nuclear winter came about. And well, it's a hypothesis at the moment that it's gonna cause any sort of significant cooling on the planet, or any sort of long-term cooling. That's a whole separate issue. I mean, there would certainly be a cooling just like during a solar eclipse or something like that, but it might be transient. It might be like, it might last for a few days maybe, but to have it, well, maybe not a few days, maybe, well, at best like a year maximum, but then it's going to return to normal again. But that's only my own like intuitive understanding of it. I haven't really done any climate studies, but again, thinking about modern climate science, it's very doubtful that nuclear winter is a thing. Okay, like what I'm getting is that we don't really understand how climate works, right? All right, so one other curiosity you may not have been aware of is that the American bombers actually accidentally bombed some places with thermonuclear weapons. And, well, they never initiated like thermonuclear explosion or even just nuclear explosion, but there was certainly there were several explosions of like conventional charges that were present in those bombs. And like basically what happened was that those B-52 bombers, they were patrolling in case Soviet Union would attack the US, because, well, they feared that they wouldn't have time to take off in case of the Soviet attack. So they kept them flying around, sometimes on like 24-hour shifts. So people were tired, and then several crashes happened because of that, and several accidental bombings of various places. So, for example, 2 thermonuclear bombs fell in North Carolina in 1961. Then in the same year, 2 bombs fell in California. Then in 1964, 2 bombs fell in Maryland. Then in 1966, I think, 4 bombs fell in Spain. And again, some of them exploded in chemical sense. So it threw all those radioactive materials for quite a large area, actually, like several kilometers probably, or maybe even more. And 4 bombs fell in Greenland in 1968. So 14 total, basically. So that's just another interesting thing. All right. Well, in general, my point here would be that nuclear energy is really our modern, well, it's sort of like a well-known statement that nuclear energy is our modern form of fire, you know, because, well, like, again, those thermal plants, thermal power stations, they utilize just regular fire, you know, they burn stuff, but nuclear energy is a completely like different level of fire, so to speak. And it's really only a modern invention, like the last 70 years or about, so that we've been able to deal with it. And so, yeah, it's really stupid not to work with nuclear energy. It's really stupid to close your power plants and not build any new. There's literally no alternatives. I mean, nuclear energy is the way to go. You might say, well, there is this, again, green energy. Well, I've already mentioned about the pollution and all kinds of bad stuff it causes. Another bad stuff it causes that you probably don't think about very often is that all those green energy alternatives, initiatives rather, they are caused by regulations from the government and taxes from the government. So the government makes, or rather governments, plural, make all the stuff more expensive so that this extra money that they get from it would be pumped into the so-called green energy. Like there was this story like several years ago in Germany, I think, or maybe some other country. So this wind energy or solar energy or something like that, it became negatively priced. So or something like that, or the price was zero or something. So, and people were amazed, like, wow, super cool, you see how effective it is? Well, that's what they see, but what they don't see is that how many people were robbed, including those very people who like are cheerful about it, to make it possible. Like, it's like everything becomes more expensive, so that you could do that instead, you know, the green energy, like the regular energy generation becomes more expensive to make this thing competitive on the market, etc. So it's an artificial thing. It's an artificial robbery of people, and it just hurts me to think about the scale of robbery that should have taken place in order to make the price of energy negative. Like it just astonishes me. I mean, it's so horrible. But yeah. Well, I've probably talked about this enough. You know, there's speaking about alternatives. Okay, this was green energy, and I've already mentioned pollution due to green energy before. But there's also, of course, this thermonuclear hypothetical controlled fusion process that we, again, supposedly can achieve. And I think it's a bad idea. I mean, we have nuclear energy. I mean, there's plenty of options. We shouldn't like chase those unknown processes that we cannot really contain, we cannot really control. Again, we have plenty of regular fission nuclear reactors that are perfect and scalable infinitely. Like we might have 10,000 reactors, but okay. So speaking about thermonuclear energy, you know, there is well, you probably know about this E.th.ph project in France, which would probably like never be built in the first place. Like they're building it since 60s perhaps or something. So it's like, and it reminded me of this peak reactor in Russia, in Gatchina. So peak, it's in Cyrillic, it's P-I-K, just pronounced like peak, but it's some abbreviation. But anyway, there was this reactor peak they've been building it since, and it's not a thermonuclear, it's just some nuclear reactor, but it's some special type of nuclear reactor, but they've been building it since 1960s. And it's only in this year, I think, it became operational first. So, yeah, and there was this famous theorem of Petrov, what they called. Well, apparently there was some guy named Petrov who came up with this theorem. So the theorem stated that it's always 2 years until peak would be operational. So wherever, like whatever the year it is right now, it's always 2 years in the future when they're gonna launch it, right? So in this sense, I propose my theorem of Eugene, perhaps you might call it, that it's always 10 years until controlled thermonuclear fusion. And you might call it first theorem of Eugene, and the second theorem of Eugene would be it's always 10 years until climate catastrophe, because you know in like 1975 they were saying that in 10 years we're all gonna die because of climate catastrophe. In 1985 they were saying the same thing, and blah blah blah. And of course 10 years is just a you might change it. You might change it to 7 years or 15 years, again, because of this uniformity, you know. Since it's always, then it doesn't matter whether it's 10 years or 6 years. So, yeah. Those are my theorems for you. All right, so probably one last thing, or like semi-last thing I wish to talk about is space exploration. And colonization, you might say, because, well, this is my point, that nuclear energy would be the best option for any sort of colony, whether it is on the moon or on Mars or wherever else. Like, it's really the best option. Like, just put a nuclear reactor there and you'll have all the energy you would need. No problem at all. I think it's self-evident. But that's only one thing to think about. But another thing to think about is that you can actually use nuclear energy for propulsion in rocket engineering, basically. And there have been projects like that, again, back in the 60s. In the US, there was so-called NERVA, NERVA, which is a nuclear engine for rocket vehicle application. And it was what is called, well, it's a nuclear engine, basically. The concept was to build sort of like what is called nuclear thermal rocket. So the idea is that you have a nuclear reactor and you just pump hydrogen through it, maybe liquid or gaseous hydrogen, I don't quite remember. Well, hydrogen, basically. Hydrogen, like H2, basically. I think so. So it gets heated up in the reactor and then thrown through the nozzle as a regular exhaust. And it gives you insane efficiency, like insane in comparison to chemical engines, like when you're just burning your hydrogen with oxygen, let's say. Like, again, in comparison to this hydrolox, hydrogen-oxygen engines, you have like roughly twice more efficiency. And again, it was tested, it works. This NERVA project have shown. So yeah, it's really the best option for reasonable space travel, I think, especially when we're talking about large payloads like crewed spacecraft. Because, well, if you have a small probe, which is uncrewed, so it's just an automatic probe, you can use other options. You can use ion engines, for example, which are ridiculously efficient. They're even better than nuclear thermal rocket. But it's like, in terms of specific impulse, like those thermal rockets from the 60s, they were like 850 seconds specific impulse. It means that the exhaust is at the velocity of 8.5 kilometers per second. Whereas ion engines might easily have efficiency, specific impulse of 3,000 seconds. So it's like 30 kilometers per second exhaust. So it's incredibly efficient. Whereas kerolox, like kerosene, oxygen engines, they typically have something like 300 and something seconds. So it's almost 3 times worse than nuclear engine. Well, hydrolox have better than that. It's like 450, but it's still almost 2 times worse than the nuclear. So there you go. But the problem, again, with ion engines, which are the most efficient so far, is that they have incredibly low thrust. It's like micronewtons. So you have to keep them operating for years, literally. And you cannot accelerate anything big with that sort of engine. So it's absolutely unfeasible for manned spacecraft, crewed spacecraft. Crewed, I mean, it's like from the word crew, not from the word crude. Right? Anyway, yeah. So I just played with it a little bit, and I've just calculated from Tsiolkovsky formula how much stuff can we throw towards Mars using those different engines. So if we have 100 tons at low Earth orbit, which is achievable with, for example, Space Launch System, SLS rocket. So it's not an impossible thing. It's actually like around the corner, let's say. 100 tons to low Earth orbit. And Saturn V was actually even better than that. It's like 140 tons, maybe, something like that. I might actually be wrong, so you have to check. So if we have 100 tons in low Earth orbit, where can we go with that? So if we have nuclear engine, this again, 60s level nuclear engine, I mean, perhaps you can make it better and even much better, but even this old crappy design, it can let you throw 65 tons to Mars. So you would only need 35 tons of propellant to get to transfer orbit towards Mars. Or if you need also another burn to stay in low Mars orbit, like 200 kilometers above the surface, you need to spend additional 14 tons. So from low Earth orbit, if you have 100-ton rocket there, well, not a rocket, but a spacecraft, you can transfer 1/2 of it roughly to the low Mars orbit, right? 51 tons. Yeah. Whereas with these Raptor engines that Elon Musk, for example, is planning to use, you can only send 37 tons to Mars, and only 22 tons can stay on lower Mars orbit. So it's like, again, it's almost twice two times worse than the nuclear, right? Or if we have 150 tons at low Earth orbit, and again, Elon Musk's spaceship, or how does it call, Starship, or this BFR thing, can deliver, supposedly at least, to low Earth orbit, 150 tons. Then with a nuclear rocket, you will be able to send 76 tons to low Mars orbit, which is an insane amount. And with Raptor engines, it's only 33. So it's roughly twice worse, 2 times worse. Yeah, so I think it's evident that the nuclear engines are much better, and they are the way forward in space exploration. And I'm really baffled why isn't that recognized by anyone. And plus, I mean, his Starship, they plan to use like 1 million of engines, like I don't quite remember. I think the second stage has something like 9 engines, whereas this thing, this nuclear engine, there's just 1 engine, or something to that effect. Of course, it's going to be heavier, much heavier. The engine itself, like these Nervas, they were like 10 or maybe 20 tons, but still, well, if you have like the larger, you maybe some new designs would be lighter, but again, it's just that not many organizations are working on the further development. It's almost like nuclear energy is banned from space. There's a serious reluctance of officials to basically allow anything like that, and it's a problem. It's really this moronic approach to nuclear energy in space. Somehow you are allowed to have nuclear energy on Earth. Well, thank God, at least we are still allowed to do that, but we cannot launch anything nuclear into space, which is ridiculous. And well, again, sort of nuclear Chernobyl in space was, I mean, the analog of Chernobyl in space was the fall of the Soviet satellite Cosmos 954, which carried nuclear reactor on board, and it fell somewhere in Canada, and some area of Canada became like polluted with nuclear waste. But it actually had a special system to remove the reactor and like to let it to leave it in some other orbit, not to get it to Earth, or maybe to make it re-enter separately and burn in the atmosphere. So it caused a lot of Chernobyl-like responses. So people said, well, let us ban nuclear stuff in space. And there were at least two other spacecraft with nuclear reactors that also fell somewhere, and it also caused some problems of that sort. But anyway, again, repeating what I've said about radiation previously, it's not as dangerous as you think, especially if the reactor disintegrates in the atmosphere. It's going to spread out over such an area that it wouldn't be any problem at all. And even smaller probes might have just those radioisotope thermal generators, RTEGs. You might think about the American spacecraft or Martian rovers, like Voyager's work on RTEGs, New Horizons works on RTEGs. Galileo probe worked on retegs. Cassini worked on retegs. So all the best things that were sent into the outer solar system used nuclear energy fundamentally. Whereas Europeans are super reluctant to use it, and therefore they get all those failures like Philae lander on Comet 67P, which got into some shadow and couldn't get any sunlight, and it died basically because of that, which is sort of ridiculous. Just put a little bit of nuclear energy, nuclear generation in it, and you'll have it working for decades, you idiots. But okay. So in terms of outer solar system, really nuclear is the way to go. But again, there is a problem because of all these suppression of nuclear development. There's not enough plutonium 238 that you need for those retegs. So it's now all those missions to the outer solar system are under question because of that, because we're too stupid to use nuclear energy basically, and we don't have enough of the needed isotopes. But okay, so one other comment I wanted to make is about this decentralization that I talked about in my Future of Agriculture video, but I don't think I need to talk about this. Like, the issue is, like, can we allow personal nuclear reactors? Is that a thing? I don't know. It's a really difficult question. Like, should the government regulate, or should people be allowed to use nuclear energy in a personal sense? But it's a very long debate, and I don't think it's necessary to make here. So let us conclude. Basically, nuclear energy is the way to go, both on Earth and in space. And if you don't agree with it, you're probably either ignorant, but hopefully this video would help you to be less ignorant, or you're just malevolent and you're just evil, basically. So nuclear energy is the cleanest and safest and the most efficient type of energy generation, and there's no alternative to that, at least yet. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.